Mark was sitting at his computer, lazily scrolling through his email. Another boring evening spent alone, slowly dissolving into the sound of rain outside his window. Recently, his life had felt empty and monotonous. Work, home, the occasional meet-up with friends, everything had turned into a routine from which there was no escape. But that evening changed suddenly when a new message appeared in his inbox. Sender, Thomas. Mark froze. The name Thomas was like something from another time. Thomas had been his best friend since childhood, but he had died 5 years ago in a car accident. For a few seconds, Mark just stared at the screen, unable to comprehend what was happening. Was this some kind of sick joke? Was someone using Thomas's old account? The message looked strange. The subject line contained only one word: goodbye. Mark's hands trembled as he clicked on the email to open it. Inside was a short but chilling message. Mark, it's time. I wanted to say goodbye. He felt his heart stop. This was impossible. Thomas was dead. Mark clearly remembered the day he learned about the accident. None of this made sense, but the message seemed real. He tried to find an explanation. Maybe someone hacked into Thomas's old account? Could it be a virus? But something deep inside whispered that it was much darker and more sinister. Mark reread the message several times. A cold fear was growing inside him. He decided to respond, even if it made him feel crazy. Who is this? Is this a joke? He typed quickly and hit send. Minutes passed, then hours, but no reply came. Mark tried to sleep that night, but every sound, every faint creak in the apartment made him jump up, filled with an overwhelming sense of dread. He felt like someone was watching him. The next morning, Mark tried to convince himself that it was all just a strange coincidence. Perhaps someone had hacked Thomas's old account, or maybe an automated system mistakenly activated an old email. He wanted to believe that, but his mind couldn't let go of the question. Mark decided to check Thomas's old social media accounts. Nothing had been updated since the day he died. Thomas's profile had become a silent memorial, where friends posted tributes after the tragedy. But today, something new had appeared on Thomas's page. A short message. Goodbye, Mark. Mark's heart raced. No one should have been able to post this. The account had been locked after Thomas's death. In a panic, Mark began checking other social networks. He needed answers, an explanation for what was happening. But the more he searched, the more the fear grew. In old photos and posts with Thomas, Mark began to notice something strange. The photos seemed different. In one picture taken a few weeks before Thomas's death, his friend's face appeared distorted. It wasn't obvious at first, but if you looked closely, Thomas's eyes were darker, and his smile was too wide, almost unnatural. Suddenly, Mark remembered the days leading up to Thomas's death. He recalled how Thomas had seemed unusually disturbed. In their last meeting, Thomas had talked about strange dreams, about seeing a shadow, about seeing himself dead in these dreams, and how the feeling haunted him. At the time, Mark hadn't paid much attention, chalking it up to stress. Now, it seemed like a dark warning that he had ignored. By that evening, Mark was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. He couldn't stop thinking about the message and the changes in the photographs. He called his friend Emily, who had also known Thomas. "You won't believe what happened," Mark began, trying to describe the strange events of the past few days. Emily listened, but there was concern in her voice. "Mark, you just need to let this go. Thomas is gone, and we all need to move on. Maybe you're just imagining it. Sometimes we see what we want to see," she said, trying to calm him down. But Mark knew it wasn't just his imagination. Something was really wrong. He decided to spend the night in his apartment and see if anything else happened. Maybe it really was just a coincidence, and his mind was tired from all the stress. But that night, things got even worse. As Mark lay in bed, his phone suddenly vibrated. He received a message. Again, it was from Thomas. "I'm near. Please open the door." Mark jumped out of bed, his heart pounding. This was impossible. He tried to convince himself it was a bad joke, but as he stood up and walked to the hallway, a cold sweat ran down his back. He didn't want to go to the door, but something strange, something insistent, was pulling him toward it. He stood before the door, frozen, unable to turn the handle. The silence in the apartment was deafening, and then suddenly he heard a knock. A soft, barely audible knock, coming from the other side of the door. Mark couldn't tear his gaze away from the door. Fear paralyzed him, but he felt like he needed to take a step forward. It seemed like the door was calling him. Slowly, with trembling hands, he reached for the lock and turned it. The door creaked open, revealing the dark hallway beyond. But no one was there. The hallway was silent, and the only sound was the wind whispering through the trees outside. Mark stood at the threshold, disbelief washing over him. But then he heard that same whisper again, the one that made his heart stop. "Mark." He turned back toward the apartment. The whisper was coming from inside. In the room where he had been sitting just a few minutes earlier, something had started to move. The shadows on the walls seemed alive, shifting, as though they were breathing. Mark stepped inside, not knowing what was happening. When he returned to the room, his phone was on the table, its screen glowing. The message from Thomas had grown longer. "I'm near. I've been looking for you, Mark. We never got to say goodbye." Mark felt something strange flash in his mind, like a dark thought settling inside him. Memories of Thomas, which had seemed so distant, suddenly became vivid and painful. He remembered how inseparable they had been as kids, how they had taken their first steps into adulthood together. But now, it felt like something had changed, like their friendship had left something unfinished, some promise that was now coming back to life in the form of this strange message. "Goodbye, Mark." The message flashed again on the screen. And in that moment, the screen went black, and the light in the room faded. The apartment was plunged into complete darkness. Mark stood in the middle of the room, surrounded by darkness. It felt as if time had stopped, as if the world around him had become something alien. The darkness grew thicker, and within it, Mark began to make out shapes. The shadows on the walls no longer seemed like a mere play of light. They were figures, moving, whispering, watching him. Suddenly, a loud noise broke the silence. The door slammed shut by itself. Mark turned sharply and saw something moving in the corner of the room. Where there had once been nothing, now a figure appeared. At first, it was indistinct, like a mist, but slowly it began to take form. "Mark?" The whisper grew louder, turning into a voice. He realized that the figure was Thomas. His face was exactly as Mark remembered it before the accident, but his eyes, they were lifeless, like windows into nothingness. "Thomas?" Mark whispered, hardly believing the words. The figure approached, but it didn't move like a living person. Its movements were slow, jerky, like something from a bad dream. Mark stepped back, his breathing quick and ragged, fear paralyzing his body. "I've been looking for you." Thomas's voice was hollow and cold. "I wanted to say goodbye. You forgot our promise." Mark desperately tried to remember what promise he was talking about. A childhood vow? A promise of friendship? Something he had long forgotten? But before he could respond, Thomas's figure drew closer. Mark felt an icy chill pierce his body. His friend's shadow covered him, and everything around him suddenly dissolved into darkness. Mark opened his eyes. He was lying on the floor of his apartment. It was morning, and the dim light was filtering through the curtains. His head ached as though he had just woken from a long nightmare. Everything that had happened the night before seemed vague and unreal. But when he looked at his phone lying nearby, the screen lit up once again. One last message from Thomas. "Now, you will also be looking for a farewell." Mark felt the cold rising inside him. This hadn't just been a dream or a trick of his imagination. He knew now that he had become part of something dark and inexplicable, and that the farewell message from his friend was only the beginning.